when one of Hollywood's most respected legends, Morgan Freeman, appeared on Good Morning America one October morning. The plan was simple: discuss his new environmental documentary and inspire viewers to care about ocean conservation. But what unfolded instead became one of the most uncomfortable and unforgettable moments in morning television history. Freeman, whose voice has narrated everything from March of the Penguins to the mysteries of the universe, entered the studio unaware that he was about to face one of the most disrespectful blindsides ever aired live. What began as a routine interview turned into 33 seconds of condescension that would end with the most dignified walk-off the show had ever seen. The Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual morning rhythm. Camera operators fine-tuned their angles, lighting crews softened every shadow, and the live audience, a mix of tourists and fans, waited eagerly for the beloved actor to appear. It was supposed to be one of those feel-good segments morning TV thrives on. An uplifting conversation with a Hollywood icon using his fame for good. Sitting at the anchor desk was Michael Strahan, ex-NFL, a star-turned-television personality who had built a reputation for charm and confidence. But on that particular morning, his demeanor carried a different energy. It wasn't the relaxed professionalism audiences were used to. It was something sharper, more performative. He wasn't just conducting an interview. He was planning a moment. As Freeman's car approached the studio, a production assistant relayed updates through her headset. Strahan smirked and told his co-hosts, "This should be interesting," in a tone that hinted at mischief. One of them warned gently, "Remember, he's here to talk about the documentary. Keep it focused." Strahan's grin widened. "Don't worry," he said. "I've got questions prepared." But Morgan Freeman wasn't a newcomer eager for screen time. At 86, he was an artist who had spent over 50 years mastering his craft, working with the greatest directors alive, earning every major award in the industry. He was a man who understood his worth and who knew exactly when to draw a line. When Freeman arrived, his presence instantly transformed the studio atmosphere. Dressed in a navy blue suit, his gold earring glinting under the lights, he exuded quiet power and warmth. Even the crew seemed to move more carefully in his presence. "It's such an honor to have you here," the production coordinator said, barely hiding her excitement. "Thank you," Freeman replied with that calm, resonant voice known around the world. "Happy to be here to talk about the oceans. It's an important subject." In the green room, the mood was light. The makeup artists worked in respectful silence, their hands steady but reverent. Freeman chatted easily about coral reefs, marine life, and the environmental experts he'd met while filming. He was genuinely enthusiastic, the kind of guest any host would dream of interviewing. "You're going to be great out there," one artist said. "The audience can't wait," Freeman smiled. "Let's hope we can get people excited about protecting our oceans." But he had no idea what awaited him. When the cameras went live, the tone shifted almost immediately. Strahan's questions grew personal, veering away from the film and toward Freeman's private life, topics that had no place in that setting. Each question carried a hint of mockery, as if the host wanted to provoke rather than engage. The audience fell silent, sensing the tension. Freeman paused, meeting Strahan's eyes with quiet composure. His silence spoke louder than any comeback could. Then, without raising his voice or losing his poise, he simply said, "I came here to talk about the oceans. If that's not what this is, I think we're done." He stood, thanked the crew, and walked off the set. No shouting, no drama, just a lesson that respect is not optional, even on live television. That morning, Morgan Freeman reminded millions that true power lies not in how loudly you speak, but in how gracefully you choose to walk away. The morning show carried on as usual, filled with light banter and weather jokes between the hosts, the kind of cheerful rhythm that had become second nature to Good Morning America. Then the energy in the studio shifted. Crew members moved quickly to position cameras, and the live audience leaned forward, anticipation thick in the air. One of Hollywood's most respected icons was moments away from stepping onto the stage. "Coming up next," Michael Strahan announced, flashing a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The legendary Morgan Freeman joins us to talk about his new documentary." As the show cut to commercial, Freeman stood quietly backstage, breathing evenly, grounding himself as he'd done countless times before interviews, premieres, and stage performances. At 86, this was routine, a conversation about an environmental documentary he'd narrated, a project close to his heart. He expected the usual questions. What inspired the film? What did you learn? What message do you hope to share? Easy, comfortable ground. But the next 10 minutes would be anything but. When the cameras came back on, the lights intensified. Strahan leaned forward, his grin wide and practiced. Well, he began, his tone laced with false humor that barely hid the sharpness beneath. Look who decided to grace us with his presence. Morgan Freeman, everybody. The voice of God himself. The audience erupted in applause, thrilled to see the legendary actor in person. Yet a few faces in the front rows shifted uneasily. Something in Strahan's tone didn't sound right. It wasn't respect, it was mockery. Freeman entered with his usual quiet grace, waving warmly at the audience. His smile was genuine, his handshake with Strahan brief but polite. "Good morning, Michael," he said in that unmistakable velvet tone. "Thank you for having me." Strahan replied with a smile that cut like glass. "Oh no, thank you for squeezing us into your very busy schedule. Must have been tough to find time for a little morning show like ours." The studio fell silent. Not the comfortable kind. The uneasy silence that settles when something suddenly feels wrong. Freeman's face remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. That almost imperceptible shift that longtime fans knew meant his patience was wearing thin. "I'm happy to be here to talk about the documentary," he said evenly. "It's about ocean preservation, an issue I think your viewers will find meaningful." Strahan waved a hand dismissively, as though the project Freeman had flown across the country to promote were an afterthought. Yeah, we'll get to that," he said, leaning forward with a smirk. "But first I've got to ask, do you ever get tired of that voice? You've been doing the same smooth, slow-talking thing for what, 100 years now?" The audience gasped. A few mouths dropped open in disbelief. This wasn't banter. It was a veiled insult, wrapped in a joke no one found funny. Camera operators glanced nervously at each other. A producer frantically gestured for Strahan to move on, but he ignored them completely. Freeman straightened in his chair. His voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "I've been acting professionally for over 50 years, he said, his words measured but firm. "And I'm proud of every role I've played, every character I've brought to life." Strahan leaned back, undeterred. "Sure," he said with exaggerated amusement. "But 50 years of playing basically the same character, right? The wise old mentor, the calm voice of reason. Don't you ever want to switch it up? Play a villain, or maybe a comedian? Show some range?" The room felt heavier. Even the audience seemed to hold its breath. Freeman's hands tightened on the armrests, his composure a study in control. "I think you're underestimating what it takes to create something meaningful," he said slowly. "Each person I've portrayed has their own story, their own depth, their own humanity. If that comes across as wise or calming, then I consider that a compliment, not a limitation." Strahan's smirk faltered. The crowd, sensing the tension, erupted into applause, not for the host, but for the man who'd just delivered a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Freeman leaned back, his expression unbothered, his voice serene. "I came here to talk about the oceans," he said softly. "But maybe today we learned something else, about respect." And in that moment, the cameras captured what viewers across the country would later call one of the most graceful takedowns in live television history. A reminder that true power never needs to raise its voice. The tension that had been building between Morgan Freeman and Michael Strahan finally reached its breaking point. What began as an awkward interview was about to turn into one of the most talked-about moments in morning television history. Strahan let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the studio. "Come on, Morgan," he said, his grin twisting into something cruel. "Between you and me, you've been coasting on that voice for decades. Anyone with a deep voice could have done those roles. It's not exactly Shakespeare we're talking about here." The words hung in the air like a slap. The studio went silent. Even the hum of background equipment seemed to fade. The audience sat frozen, disbelief written across their faces. Crew members stopped mid-motion, exchanging uneasy glances. In seconds, the tone had shifted from uncomfortable to catastrophic. Freeman leaned forward, his calm demeanor taking on an unmistakable weight. When he spoke, his voice dropped into that measured, commanding quiet that could silence a room more effectively than shouting ever could. "Michael," he began evenly, "I came here this morning to discuss a documentary that matters, a project about our oceans, about marine ecosystems collapsing, about the future of our planet. I didn't come here to have 5 decades of dedication to my craft dismissed by someone more interested in cheap shots than conversation." "Whoa, whoa," Strahan interrupted, raising his hands in mock surrender. His smile, however, was anything but apologetic. "Sensitive much? I'm just having a little fun. You Hollywood types are always so serious. Can't take a joke, huh?" Freeman's gaze didn't waver. "There's a difference between humor and disrespect," he said, his words deliberate and precise. "And right now, you're not just crossing that line, you're obliterating it," the audience murmured, sensing the shift. Strahan's smirk faltered for a moment before morphing into something uglier. "Oh, I'm crossing a line? That's rich, coming from someone who hasn't been told no in 30 years, he sneered. "You're in my house now, buddy. This is my show. And if I want to ask about your limited acting range or your one-trick pony career, I'll ask." The gasps from the audience were audible. This wasn't edgy television. It was open hostility. Even the producers in the wings looked horrified. Freeman stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled, radiating quiet power. The entire room seemed to freeze as the 86-year-old legend rose to his full height. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried effortlessly across the studio. "Professional," he said evenly, "would have been preparing real questions about the work I came here to discuss. Professional would have been treating your guest with basic respect. But clearly, professionalism isn't something you value this morning." Strahan's face flushed red as he stood too, trying to reassert control. "Oh, please," he snapped. "You think you're too good for my questions? I've interviewed presidents, athletes, movie stars bigger than you. Nobody walks off my set." Freeman met his glare without blinking. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, beginning to unclip his microphone, "you should consider why I'm choosing to." The room was so still that the faint click of the mic being removed was audible through the silence. "I've been in this industry for over 50 years, Freeman continued. "I've faced tough questions, personal ones, even uncomfortable ones. But I've never sat through an interview where the host was more intent on tearing me down than discussing the work. Never one where basic respect was so absent." As Strahan stepped out from behind his desk, his posture turned aggressive. The cameras captured every tense second. His clenched jaw, his narrowed eyes, his loss of control. "You know what your problem is?" he said, pointing a finger. "You're an entitled diva. You come on my show expecting everyone to worship you, and the second someone asks a real question, you run away like a child." Freeman paused, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and weary understanding. His voice was almost soft, but every word sliced through the room with precision. "A real question," he said, "would have been about the coral reefs dying in our oceans. A real question would have been about the marine life struggling to survive in waters warming because of human activity. But instead, you chose arrogance over awareness, ego over empathy." He placed the microphone on the table, nodded politely to the stunned crew, and walked off the set without another word. That morning, Morgan Freeman didn't just end an interview, he delivered a timeless lesson that real power isn't about who controls the stage, but who walks off it with their integrity intact. "A real question," Morgan Freeman said evenly, "would have shown that you actually watched the documentary, or even glanced at the material your producers sent you, that you prepared for this interview in any meaningful way." He removed his microphone, the small movement loaded with quiet finality, and handed it to a trembling production assistant who looked ready to vanish into the floor. "I don't need to watch your little nature film to ask questions," Strahan shot back, his composure cracking, the arrogance now fully exposed. "I'm the host. I decide what we talk about." "And I," Morgan replied, his tone calm and unshaken, "I'm the guest who has the right to leave when the host shows nothing but contempt." His words carried the weight of decades, measured, steady, and impossible to dismiss. I've done hundreds of interviews in my career, Michael. Some of them tough, some of them uncomfortable. But those journalists challenged me because they cared about the craft. They wanted to illuminate, not belittle. There's a difference. The studio was utterly silent. Even the air seemed to still. Some in the audience blinked back tears, watching what felt like a lesson in dignity unfold in real time. "You're making a huge mistake," Strahan said suddenly, desperation creeping into his voice. "This is Good Morning America. Millions of people watch this show. You're going to look like the bad guy here." Morgan met his eyes steadily. "I'd rather look like a man who stands up for himself than one who sits quietly while being disrespected on national television. Your viewers are smarter than you give them credit for. They'll see who crossed the line today." "What happened here," Strahan snapped, his tone rising to a fevered pitch, "is that a past his prime actor couldn't handle a little real talk. You want everyone to kiss your ring and tell you how amazing you are? Newsflash, your best days are behind you. That documentary you're so proud of, it's going to tank. Nobody wants to hear Morgan Freeman narrate anything in that same boring voice again." The words struck the room like a physical blow. Even Strahan seemed to realize instantly that he'd gone too far. His face paled as the reality of what he had just said, on live television, began to sink in. Morgan didn't move for several long seconds. Then slowly he smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had just witnessed another person's self-destruction. "That," he said softly, "is exactly why I'm leaving. Because this was never about a conversation. It was about you trying to tear someone down to make yourself feel bigger. And I have too much respect for myself, for my work, and for everyone who helped create this documentary, to be part of that." He turned and walked toward the exit, each step deliberate and composed, a man who understood that grace was the ultimate form of power. "Wait." Strahan called after him, the bravado gone, replaced with raw panic. "Morgan, come on, can't we just—" Freeman paused and looked back one final time. His expression carried something close to pity. "Michael, I hope you figure out what made you think treating people this way was acceptable. You have a platform that reaches millions, and you just used it to demonstrate the worst of what power does when it isn't handled responsibly." Then he walked off the Good Morning America set, head high, dignity intact. The applause began slowly, one person then another, until the entire studio erupted into thunderous, sustained clapping. It wasn't polite applause. It was admiration. It was relief. It was the audience recognizing, instinctively, that they had just witnessed integrity in its purest form. Behind him, chaos unfolded. Producers rushed onto the set. Strahan stood frozen, the color drained from his face. His co-hosts avoided his gaze, their discomfort filling the silence. The cameras, still rolling, caught every second of the aftermath until someone finally whispered, "We're going to commercial," but the damage was already irreversible. Within minutes, the clip flooded social media. Within an hour, it became one of the most replayed moments in morning television history. And the reaction was universal. People hailed Morgan Freeman, not as an actor, but as a man who showed the world what self-respect looks like under fire. Later that day, as his car pulled away from the studio, Freeman sat quietly before dialing the documentary's director. "The interview didn't happen," he said with a small smile. "But I think people are going to hear about the documentary anyway." He was right. Within hours, the film's website crashed from the flood of visitors. Strahan's attempt to humiliate Freeman had done the exact opposite. It had elevated both him and his message far beyond anything a routine morning interview ever could. The backlash against Michael Strahan was immediate and merciless. Within hours, social media was ablaze with outrage. "I just watched Morgan Freeman handle the most disrespectful interview with such grace," one viral post read. Meanwhile, Michael Strahan revealed exactly who he is when he has power over someone. Disgusting. Celebrities and fans alike joined the chorus. Directors who had worked with Freeman shared stories of his professionalism and quiet kindness. Fellow actors spoke about how he had mentored them, uplifted others, and treated everyone on set, whether a co-star or a crew member, with unwavering respect. Environmentalists chimed in too. Morgan Freeman spent weeks with marine biologists for that documentary, one advocate wrote. He dove with scientists, asked thoughtful questions, and cared deeply about the work. Strahan couldn't even be bothered to watch a single frame before mocking his voice. That tells you everything. By that afternoon, ABC executives were holding emergency meetings. Advertisers were calling nervously, demanding clarification. Strahan's co-hosts began issuing carefully worded statements, quietly distancing themselves from the controversy. Through it all, Morgan Freeman remained silent. He didn't tweet, didn't release a statement. He simply let his composure speak louder than any rebuttal ever could. 3 days later, ABC released a formal apology. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Freeman for the unprofessional conduct during his recent appearance. We are committed to treating all guests with the respect they deserve. Between the lines, everyone understood. Strahan had been reprimanded, possibly suspended, and his once stable seat on the show was now uncertain. But perhaps the most profound response didn't come from celebrities or critics. It came from ordinary viewers, people who recognized themselves in what they'd witnessed. People who knew what it felt like to be dismissed, belittled, or disrespected by someone in power. I just quit a job where my boss talked to me the way Strahan talked to Morgan Freeman, one woman wrote. Watching him walk away with such dignity gave me the courage to do the same. Another post summed it up perfectly. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept disrespect. 2 weeks later, Freeman's documentary premiered to record-breaking viewership. The opening credits carried a simple dedication: for everyone working to protect our oceans, and for everyone who's ever had to walk away from toxicity with their head held high. Critics hailed the film, not only for its environmental message, but also for the heart and sincerity in Freeman's narration. Freeman's voice conveys genuine care for these ecosystems, one reviewer wrote. It's clear this is more than a project to him. It's a purpose, which makes Strahan's mockery all the more shameful. What had begun as an uncomfortable morning show interview had become something much larger, a cultural moment about respect, dignity, and boundaries. It reminded millions of viewers that self-worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond when that treatment crosses a line. Think Pieces debated the same question. Was Morgan Freeman right to walk off? Should he have stayed and salvaged the interview? But for anyone who had watched it unfold, the answer was obvious. Freeman had given Strahan multiple chances to change course. He had remained calm, articulate, and composed, even as the host tried to provoke him. He didn't raise his voice or retaliate. Instead, he explained his reasons, stood up for his principles, and walked away, not in defeat, but in quiet triumph. He turned an uncomfortable moment into a masterclass, not in acting, but in integrity. Freeman reminded the world of something too often forgotten, that we teach others how to treat us. That boundaries matter, that self-respect is not negotiable, and that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't a speech or an argument. It's the decision to walk away. The studio where it all happened resumed its usual morning broadcasts, but the memory of that day lingered. Crew members spoke of it for years. Audience members told friends they'd witnessed history being made. And millions who watched online carried forward a simple but profound truth. Real strength isn't about enduring mistreatment. It's about recognizing it and having the courage to leave. At 86 years old, with 5 decades of extraordinary work behind him and nothing left to prove, Morgan Freeman had reminded the world what dignity looks like when tested, and that lesson reached far beyond Hollywood, beyond talk shows, beyond fame itself. It resonated in offices, classrooms, and homes. Anywhere people needed the courage to stand tall, Freeman didn't just walk off a set that morning. He walked straight into the hearts of millions, showing them by example what it truly means to know your worth and never settle for less.